story time about how a stranger wandered into my house and it led to something amazing. I woke up one night to someone ringing my doorbell over and over vigorously. I looked at the clock and I saw it was 3 in the morning. I went to the door and looked out of the peephole and saw a young woman outside on my porch. I opened the door and could immediately tell that she was intoxicated. She started explaining to me that she was at a bar down the street and lost her phone. That's when she asked if she could use mine and call someone for a ride home. It was freezing outside, so I reluctantly let her in. She asked me for water, so I led her to the kitchen. She proceeded to open my fridge and start eating my lunch meat and various other snacks. She then kicked off her heels and sat down at the table with a jar of pickles and started talking to me like she's known me for years. She told me her name was Krista and asked me how work was and what I was up to tomorrow. I reminded her that she needs to call someone to come pick her up and handed her my cell phone. She took the phone and FaceTimed her brother. She told him that she needs a ride but she has no idea where she's at and handed me the phone to talk to him. I told him the situation and gave him my address to come pick her up ASAP. A few seconds later, my doorbell began ringing again and someone started banging on my door. I went to the door and opened it to find a guy outside and he looked furious. This is when things got intense. Part 2 of how a stranger wandered into my house and it led to something amazing. I opened the door and quickly found out that this guy was Chris's boyfriend and it became clear that they were in some sort of fight. Krista started telling him to leave and accused him of following her and kept screaming at him that it's over between them. The guy turned his attention to me and asked what guy Krista was here to sleep with and began accusing her of coming here to cheat. He started yelling at me for helping her. All of a sudden, he grabbed Krista by her hair and started dragging her out of the house. I quickly ran after them and started screaming at the top of my lungs for him to let her go. Luckily, one of my neighbors heard the commotion and came to our aid. The guy let Krista go, but now he was trying to fist fight my neighbor. A few seconds later, a truck pulled up to my house and a man jumped out, which turned out to be Krista's brother. I quickly explained the situation and helped Krista into his truck. Krista's brother proceeded to confront her boyfriend, who was still making a scene, knocked him out clean with one hit, and drove off, leaving her boyfriend knocked out cold on my front lawn. Her brother texted me the next day thanking me and apologizing for knocking that guy out in my yard. We started texting back and forth and getting along, and I actually asked him out a couple days later. We've been dating for a few months now thanks to his drunk sister stumbling onto my porch. I guess everything happens for a reason.
Okay, so on my FYP lately, I've been seeing so many videos of like, watch my husband fall out of love with me, which is exactly what I watched happen whenever I went through my pregnancy with my boyfriend's child. So in December of 2019, I found out that I was pregnant and I was so excited. And my boyfriend was overjoyed. We literally had one of the best relationships during this time. But once COVID hit in 2020, I ended up getting laid off of work. He continued to work, but I felt like it was pointless for me to find another job just because I was about to have a baby and raise a kid. And in April, we get to find out the gender, and guess what? It was a boy. I was extremely happy, but then I just started to notice that he stopped caring. Like, I would be like, hey, the baby is kicking, and he would just be like, okay. Completely monotone, completely blank face. Then June comes around and I ended up gifting him an iPhone 11 Pro Max. Since it was under my name, I had access to see who could text and call him. And I know a lot of his family's numbers, including cousins and aunts, but there was one number that I didn't recognize that stood out the most. And the messages between him and this number would not stop until 3 a.m., which is when he would go to sleep. So I decided to go up and ask him who is more important than me and his son. Storytime part 2 on my boyfriend cheating on me with his coworker and his ex. So his response to me asking who is more important than me and his son is, no one, babe. I just said okay, and a couple months go by and I go into labor. He's not even excited and doesn't even try to care. A few months later, and I see that number pop back up again. And I also noticed that there was an exchange of pictures going on. So I decided to call the number up and be like, hey, who is this? How do you know my boyfriend? And she responded with, who is this and why do you need to know this? Because I'm with him. I was bawling and I tried to confront him on it, but he literally denied it. And then he threatened me because I don't work that he would take my son away and get full custody. And because of all this crap, I just shut up and agreed to make it work for our son. And then not even a few weeks later, I see that number pop back up again and I lose my ish. Now, I don't condone violence, but the second that this man got home, I was so upset that I ended up punching him and he fell into the wall. I went through his phone and ended up finding out that he was also talking to another girl as well. So I whipped the phone around in his face and I was like, who is this? Storytime part 3 to my boyfriend cheating on me with his ex and coworker. Now that I officially have this man's phone, I can see everything. When I asked him who the first girl was, he was like, no one. And I was like, no, straight up, who is she? And he finally admitted that she was a coworker. So I go through his pictures and I see that they took selfies together, like really close selfies. And he also took a pic of her butt. There's literally a whole video where she's shaking it for him. I started bawling and I threw everything at him. I left the house for several days. We agreed to try to fix things again, but I'm taking his paychecks and messing around with his cousin now to get revenge on him. And honestly, him and his cousin look a lot alike. So if I ever were to get pregnant again, he wouldn't even question it. Also, if you didn't catch on, the other girl was his ex-girlfriend and she still reaches out asking him for money and asking him to move in with her. And even when we were trying to work things out, he would constantly think about leaving our family for her. If you guys have a story that you would like me to share on my TikTok, follow my Instagram and I'll show you how.
This is why you should be careful who you talk to online. When I was 15 and getting into my junior year, I created a Twitter account. I didn't tell anyone my username, including my family or friends. I also didn't upload any pictures or specify my exact location, and I put a different city than where I lived. I had around 30 followers and I didn't follow many people. One evening in October, someone sent me a weird direct message. They had 200 followers and the message read, "Hi, I'm Robin, I just turned 17. I wanted to know if you lived in the city because I'm moving there and I'm going to that high school soon. I'd like to make some new friends." I immediately thought something was wrong because nowhere in my profile did I list my actual town, but I remembered a tweet I made a few weeks ago about buses in which I mentioned my city. I was bored and he was polite, so we started talking. The discussion was mainly about high school, teachers, and cafeteria food. As it got later in the night, he started asking more personal questions like if I lived far from the school or if I was ever home alone. I never answered these questions because it was too shady for me. The next day we talked again and started bonding. I developed feelings for him over the next few weeks. He was handsome and super kind, which was everything I needed after being bullied for so many years. We had a 2-week vacation in October, and at the end of it is when he finally told me that he would be attending my high school. I was so excited to finally meet him. Part 2 of why you should be careful who you talk to online. He asked to pick a place to meet during the morning break on our first day back to school after break. I was so happy to meet him and told him to join me in the hall. However, when he realized people would be around, he said he'd rather meet me in an isolated place because he might not recognize me in a crowd. It was a good enough excuse for me, and I told him to meet me in the 3rd floor bathroom because we weren't allowed to stay there during breaks and no one would disturb us. In my head, it seemed a little creepy, but since we were in school, I was confident that nothing bad could happen. I dressed up and made myself really pretty and counted down the minutes till we met. When he arrived, it was him. He wasn't a catfish, but he looked a little older than 17. We talked and got along so well, and at the end of it, he asked me to go to lunch with him. I refused because I didn't have money and wouldn't let anyone pay for me. He seemed disappointed but offered to walk me home after class. I told him I have to take the bus, but he could walk me there. This became a routine for another 2 months. One day, I complained about how lonely I'd be at home as everyone in my family was going to be out that day. I know it was reckless, but I thought I could trust him by this point. That evening, he walked me to the bus stop. I waved goodbye and put my headphones in. Little did I know that my life was in danger. Part 3 of why you should be careful who you talk to online. When I got off, I had a weird gut feeling that someone was watching me. Since it was December, it was already dark by the time that I had gotten off the bus. I paused my music but kept my earphones in not to draw suspicion. It was silent in my suburban neighborhood, especially at night. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I knew someone was following me. As quietly as possible, I reached for my keys in my pocket. As soon as I pulled them out, I ran. It was the best and fastest sprint of my life. I somehow managed to open and close the door before he could reach me. I deactivated the alarm and looked through the glass panel on the door. It wasn't a peephole but a whole window, so if someone wanted to see inside the house, they could. Standing there looking at me with the creepiest face was Rob. He followed me home, probably with a car, and I was paralyzed. We stared at each other for a minute before I ran to the kitchen to grab a knife. When I got back to the door, he was still there and started banging. I feared the glass would break, but it didn't. After 5 minutes, he stopped and went around the house banging on every shutter until he came back to the door. He looked angry, but my neighbor's car pulled in and he ran off, probably thinking it was my family. After this, he harassed me online, which finally made me delete my Twitter. No one even knew or heard of him, which is probably why he looked older. I never heard of him again, but I still wonder what could have happened that night.
Part 3 story time about how my grandma got my teacher fired. So like I said in part 2, I bought the batch of cookies to my teacher, Mrs. Wilson, and she starts to eat on them in class. Now I'm only in 5th grade, so I genuinely just thought my grandma made her a batch of cookies for some reason. So as I'm doing my work, I look up and I notice my teacher's like laying across her desk laughing at her phone in a weird way. So she's acting really weird and goofy. She grabs her phone and calls my grandma. So in the sloppiest, weird way, she tells her how much she loves those cookies. Then she tells our classroom we don't ever have to do homework again, and she's laughing hysterically. She starts taking her shoes off and undoing her hair and running around the classroom just acting crazy. Now, at this time, our door was open, so I'm pretty sure teachers heard. So the principal comes by our room to see what's going on in there. So at this point, my teacher is laying on the ground with no shoes on. My grandma put edibles in the cookie. She was then fired for illegal substances. I had no more problems out of her.